Welcome to Play the Man Podcast, a podcast seeking to build sturdy men in a wobbly world.
Welcome back to the Play the Man Podcast. Today we've got Pastor Peter Johnson, Pastor Shane Pennington, and myself, Zach Fink. And we're talking about a book that we've recently shared, and I think you guys have read it a while ago. I just recently read it. And it's called Leadership and Emotional Sabotage by Joe Rigney. We're also doing it, the video series, in our Man U class on Sunday mornings. But we thought it would be really a great topic to start just kind of an ongoing conversation around the book of Nehemiah that we've been studying from the pulpit, but also just a great timely topic for all of us in general. So, we should probably open up with a little bit of a high-level summation as to what this looks like. Do you guys? I don't know how long ago was when you guys read it, so it might have been a minute, but
I mean, maybe just a brief summary. So, in a way, it's Christianizing a secular book by Edwin Friedman, A Failure of Nerve. And so Rigney, I think, used that in some of his leadership classes. So he's kind of, instead of having to re-explain Friedman to Christians over and over, like, how can I just take that, plunder the Egyptians, he says, and then Christianize that so it makes sense in a Christian context. And so that's kind of where the book's coming from. And a lot of the book is about, being steered, about giving in to pressure, about, the way institutions are pulled off track, the way they're sabotaged, both from external forces and those who are internal as well. And so a really helpful book for men in particular, I think, because he addresses it both in kind of in society, but also in the church, in your home. What does it look like to have these forces trying to steer you, trying to pull you off track? And it may not always be, high-level malfeasance. It just might be, this is the way the world works, that as maybe we'll talk about, is sometimes the most immature members of any group or institution, the institution will end up bending to those people, which then creates an environment where your most mature and productive members start to check out. And then it's kind of a death spiral from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great summation. And, there's some pretty interesting topics, I feel like, that are introduced to kind of build the context of what he wants to get to. And one of them is, in the beginning of the book, he talks about this concept of a degree. Do you remember?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Degree. I have the quote here. He says, "Degree is the principle of cultural order or rule or hierarchy. It includes things like priority, place, incisure, course, proportion, season, form, office, and custom in all line of order." Mm-hmm. Right? And so as believers, we have some distinct experience, or directly given to us from the words of God, right, as to what degree ought to or could look like, because there is order, right? We see hierarchical order, we see order given to us through the redemption story of mankind, right? And he's basically explaining that as the further away we get from this order, this degree, the more off course or upside down things start to look like. Mm-hmm. And then one of the outcomes of it is an ongoing kind of display of anxiety, right? He talks about this in terms of how, if up is down, how anxious everyone feels about that, right? Yeah. If left is right, how do we make a left turn when we say make left and you make a right turn, right? It's this topsy-turvy world we can live in. And so he kind of sets that as this foundation, and then he builds on it to say this creates an anxious person, it creates an anxious society, and we need to rebel against that by drawing ourselves back to order, back to Christ's order, and so forth. So I don't know, I thought that was helpful, and I've never really read this term. I felt very unread when he explained this to me, like, oh, degree.
Well, fortunately, we haven't seen any of that disorder in our culture.
No anxiety at all. Our culture is not anxious whatsoever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's very applicable for Play the Man. I mean, this book, this idea, this concept we're discussing is for everyone. But I think it specifically Play the Man when you think of that degree of men in leadership at home, at work, at church. But this idea that we've talked fairly amount in church is this fear of man, right?
Yeah.
Versus the degree, if you will, of the order of the fear of God. That it's the fear of man that steers us.
Was degree, was that Friedman's term? Is that what he equated sober-mindedness with, if I remember right, or not?
Yeah. He was quoting Ulysses.
Oh, yeah.
Quote.
Okay,
but I think it was Friedman that
And
kind
he
of
also
introduced
applied
it.
it with Shakespeare, right? Because then he goes into the long Shakespeare.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And he kind of rolls into this concept of being sober-minded as a kind of not a litmus test, but a way to ground us toward our principles, right? Like being sober-minded is an imperative, or else you will be upturned by this lack of order around you and all this anxiety around you. What came to mind for you guys when you guys were kind of going through that in terms of what does this look like today? What is sober-mindedness? How does it like manifest in front of us in good or negative ways potentially?
I mean, it's weird thinking about it, because I think I read this kind of before some current events that have happened where, post-election and things like that. But it really, to me, felt like, just going back and thinking on these concepts, the world got turned upside down for a couple of years. And the most immature, most emotionally unstable people kind of took charge of everything.
Those with the most intersections had the authority.
Yeah, but I mean, it was a time where everything got turned upside down, right? And even what is a man and a woman gets redefined. Everything gets redefined. It was a very anxious time, and it's just interesting to me when kind of the adults came back, in charge and just said, no, we're not going to do that, and there's two genders, and this is how the world works, and how even people who may be extremely left-leaning sort of breathed a sigh of relief of like, it was common sense, but there's a sense of sober-mindedness. There's a sense of order being restored, of dad came home, of the monkeys are no longer running the zoo, whatever you want to say, but you could feel almost like the tension decrease in a sigh of relief. And I feel like that's just a practical way of seeing it in larger society. And I think, if you've ever been in an institution that's happened, I think of the military right now, especially you, Pete, having been in the military, of that whole idea too, of when you have the most immature people and you're kowtowing to them and they're the ones who are in charge, morale goes way down. You're most mature, you're most competent, all of those people, they check out. Recruiting was a disaster for the military. And now you got guys like Hegseth who are back saying, no, we're going to build the world's most lethal fighting machine. We're going to get back to who we are. We're going to get back on mission, right? And when that gets stated, then you start seeing morale rise and you start seeing those competent, mature people coming back into play, and you see everybody else kind of bugging out. And I think that's just another way. Now, we talk about other institutions and churches, but those are the ones that really kind of hit home because they're so fresh right now as we're recording this today.
Yeah, those are great examples.
Yeah, I'm exploring. I told you the other day I'm reading this book, Fault Lines by Vodi Bakum, and he's very meticulously walking through in 2018. Actually, he chronically goes back through history, kind of in recent history, about how critical race theory sort of impacted evangelicals, right? And we talked about this already before, but I thought that was a helpful. It feels like a lot of people lacked sober-mindedness during that process, like coming to a place where hey, we need to lean on some sociological textbooks and evidence to interpret the scripture, right? Just that a whole idea that like we have a hermeneutic principle, which is the scripture interprets itself. And then, we have some stalwart Christians who have thought or said that for decades and decades. And then all of a sudden this one thing hit and it started to like change people's tune and tone around that principle. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, it happened quickly, and then there was some, there was a lot of, aftershocks from that. But I mean, the folks that stayed, let's say, sober-minded during that period of time stayed on the original hermeneutic principle, which is to say Scripture has to interpret itself. And that's always going to have to be the case. And it's been like that, right? That's a principle that's been around for a long, long time, right? But I don't think it's easy to be sober-minded when, let's say, all of your peers are falling off of that.
Right.
I mean, I don't know. It's just kind of a top-of-mind example for me right now. But sober-mindedness is, in itself is this. It's a trait. It's almost something that it grounds you, and as soon as you're not, you need someone to help you who's sober-minded see that again. Right? It's almost like we need each other to remind us of what it should look like. Right.
Well, I think I like the title of Friedman's book too, because his was Failure and Nerve, and that is really what you see when that happens.
Yeah.
Why did all these things happen? Because those in leadership had a failure of nerve.
Yeah.
There was cowardice. They didn't stand up. They didn't declare what they know to be true, and things got blown over. But and I like what Rigney uses the word sober-mindedness as being shock absorbers, so that when those cultural winds hit or whenever the impact comes, good sober-minded leaders, they act as shock absorbers for their institutions, for their families. You don't feel it so much,
And they sober other minds, right?
Yeah, they do.
It's kind of like it's kind of like courage, right?
Yeah,
one
courage
man
breeds
shows
courage, right?
Courage breeds courage, but someone absorbs around being sober-minded, and then there's something intuitive in us, whether we're believers or not. Like, wait, maybe there are only two genders. What was I thinking? And we're seeing that in our society now. We're people that you said that are left-leaning, that are kind of coming back and saying, wait, this actually makes sense. Right?
Yeah.
But they weren't the ones leading it.
Right.
Right. Kind of like that doctor who's also the PCA pastor that is 5 years analysis of post-COVID. What do we do? Wear your masks. It's just like, where's the sober-mindedness there?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so then he kind of steps on into that, and I thought these were really excellent topics and really interesting things to unpack. But he talks a lot about, getting sabotaged, and he discusses a couple of things. One of them steering, and then the other one is this sin of empathy. Unpack that a little bit, because I think that it wasn't the first time I'd heard it once we got to the conclusion, but I don't think I'd really put it in that lens before.
You want to take steered? I'll let you take steered. I'll take empathy. So
Okay. I think being steered is just being, it's being manipulated. It's like, what we just saw in Nehemiah last week, where, they're trying to flatter him. They're trying to bring him along with the cool guys. Hey, we're meeting in the Valley of Ono, and, we want you there. And he's like, no. He's kind of seeing through that. He's refusing in a sober-minded way to say, I'm staying on mission, right? And then they up the ante and they accuse him of insurrection, and this could get to Artaxerxes, and this could be a big problem. And he's like, that's a fabrication of your mind. No such things happened. I'm not, I'm not coming. I'm not afraid. I won't be steered.
Yep. I think Rigney used the word. He has a phrase something like ugly words for things that are true and ugly words for things that are false. Right. Like either way. And I think of that, when you were preaching last week on Nehemiah of, were they rebuilding the wall? Yeah, it's true. But what did they get accused of? Insurrection, right? So false a false narrative about things that are actually true. And I feel like, I think Rigney really is helping us brace, because as Christians, we care about our reputation. We want to be brave. We want to be strong. We want to be courageous. We want to keep our institutions on mission, but we also care so much about our name and our reputation and those things. And, we've already talked about the sin of niceness and all of that. And it all feeds into this. And I just think, what do we not want? We don't want someone to call us a Christian nationalist. That's an ugly word for something that's probably true. You know what I mean? And we also don't want to be called racist, which is an ugly word for something that's false, And so, but you're going to be called ugly words for things you actually do hold to and things you don't hold to. And you got to be willing to own it,
And the steering is so closely related to this issue of empathy or the sin of niceness, right?
Yeah,
because if you don't agree with something or a certain person's position, you're not nice to them. That's cruel. So you're a hater. We don't like being called a Christian nationalist, or we don't like being called a hater. And, I don't want to be that guy. So it steers us.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, for most people, when they hear empathy, they're like, is that a good thing? And certainly, I think if I understand Rigney right, what he's saying is, we don't have to jump into people's mess, you know what I mean, in order to empathize with them in their immaturity, in their mess, and all of that, in order to help them. In fact, the only way you can actually help them is by staying out of their mess and out of their immaturity, being that sober-minded presence, not diving into the raging river with them and holding on to them as you both go over the waterfall, but you're the one who actually throws the life preserver and pulls them out. And to be doing that, you have to be standing firmly on something solid on the bank, and so often we've been taught that we've got to jump in with them and in order to empathize, when all that does is just, we get carried away and swept away with them. And so, and so we have all of those cultural impulses trying to manipulate us and steer us that way as well.
Yeah, I mean, to bring back this idea of being in an age of anxiety, right? If we're all empathizing in each other's anxieties, like, I don't know what that's producing, but it's a spiral down to sadness and all sorts of things, because, there isn't sort of a rock or a sober-mindedness to kind of steer you back to the degree, right? To the thing that's grounding everybody, because you're empathizing with everybody's whatever, right? And it does feel a little like that right now. If you read headlines on news, it's just, you're empathizing with the most random headline. Like, the headlines are tethered together in the weirdest possible ways to get you to click on it. And it's this deep, anxious sort of concept that you sometimes end up reading. That's nonsense, mostly, It
just becomes the blind leading the blind at that point.
Yeah.
That's not helpful for anyone.
Well, I think about this area being steered and being manipulated, which happens in our everyday life wherever we might be. But I also think about how they've done experiments with this, very simple ones with group dynamics, i.e., you have a line or maybe a ruler that is clearly longer than the other, but only one person in the group isn't informed, and everyone says, oh, that longer ruler is actually shorter. And the guy's probably thinking, no, it's not. And then it gets to the point where it's very consistent. That guy will say, yep, that's the shortest one. And it's not. And we see that happening.
Yeah.
That's the sort of, there's a steering, but then there's the herd mentality that just, we don't want to stand up for truth.
Yeah.
Even when we know it's true, but everyone else doesn't agree with it.
Yeah.
So vital for the church today.
Yeah, it is. And then so that's kind of the first half of the book. And honestly, we're talking about this book like it's lengthy. It's like 80 pages.
It's very concise.
It's very readable.
Yeah, it's very short. It's very readable, And so the second half focuses on, courage in our spheres of influence, right? So as a man, courage in the home, courage in the church, and then courage within your communities. And, I think Nehemiah that we've been studying has great application in all three, and specifically within the church and then within the communities as well. So what were your guys' practical kind of takeaways for those three spheres of influence, and what's some things to kind of share with the group here?
I made a list of things that he had written about strengthening our nerve, and so he has this like a list, and it is interesting how much this parallels with Nehemiah, because even the first thing on the list is take responsibility for yourself. It's exactly how Nehemiah starts off. The first chapter of the book, he takes responsibility for his own sin. He takes responsibility for the sin of the people. We're in this mess because we got into this mess. And so, Rigney does talk a lot about, abdication and idolatry and blame shifting and all that happened in the garden and how we continue to do that. The place to start is ourselves. We take responsibility. It starts with us. That's where sober-mindedness begins. And, sin's not a zero-sum game. You can take 100% of the responsibility. And I love that Nehemiah starts by just taking responsibility in that book. Some of the other ones, the be willing to be called ugly names. We've already talked about that, but that's Nehemiah. No failure of nerve when he's being called ugly names. Make sure the slander is actually false. When you are slandered, do not respond in kind. Even last week, Nehemiah slandered, and he doesn't slander back, but he takes his appeal to God. God, you judge them.
Answers in truth.
Yeah.
And what hit me about that is even people that are trying to steer you, when you reply in truth, whether they admit it or not, they resonate with that. There's a weight to that in itself. You don't need to say anything more. Mm-hmm. People will recognize the truth. Mm-hmm. They may buck against it and be working against it, but it's truth nonetheless. Has its own power.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. I don't remember which part of the book where he points out that so much of some of the deepest manipulation is actually those on the inside, right? It's being steered by other Christians. And sometimes that manifests itself in, guilt by association. You got to distance yourself from this group because this group conversed with this group, and that becomes a form. But I just think of how much we've seen that in evangelicalism, of getting steered and manipulated by our own, and it's been interesting in recent months, we found out that some of those people who were steering us were getting money from U.S. aid and are themselves being steered by unchristian. There are people out there who want to steer the church who are using Christians to steer the church and steer us. And that's probably the most dangerous form that it comes in. And there's examples of that in Nehemiah as well, right? That the outside forces are collaborating with the inside forces in order to steer Nehemiah.
Well, these same guys that you just spoke about are steering other Christians by calling them Christian nationalists.
Right.
Yet they're receiving government money.
Right.
For what purpose?
Exactly.
Right? Who knows?
Yeah, but the ugly names you're getting called are the things they're doing. Yeah.
Right.
The ugly things they're doing. And where I think of Shemaiah even giving the false prophecy towards Nehemiah, to try to get him to discredit himself and to sin against God by hiding in the temple and everything that you've preached on recently, Peter. And it's just like, there are Shemaiahs out there, right, who are giving us false information, false prophecies, false words, and it's all being directed by people behind them who want to destroy the church and want to destroy Christianity. And so just so applicable. But and one of the final ones, root your resistance to sabotage in a sincere desire to please God. I think that's something we see in Nehemiah as well. That everything he does is on point, on mission, to please the Lord. That's why he's there. That's why he's building the wall. That's why he's taking the lumps. That's why he stands firm and courageous.
And how do you stand firm? How do you remain courageous? How do you consistently be sober-minded? And I think what Nehemiah shows us, especially in these last couple chapters, is he has no doubt that God is going to vindicate him. Like that's his confidence, that's his courage, that's his hope. And I think as individual Christians, that's what we need to keep in mind. We're going to be steered, we're going to be manipulated, we're going to be called nasty names, but Christ is going to vindicate us, standing with the truth, speaking the truth. And I don't necessarily mean just ultimately, right? Well, in heaven, this is all just like, no, today you'll be vindicated, right? I think we can see it. Doesn't mean we're going to hit hard times, but speak the truth, remain faithful, and have the confidence that God is going to vindicate the situation.
I think there's, I'm just going to say, for men out there, a lot of really practical advice for just how to be a husband, how to do this in your home. I think of his little pithy quotes, of like, a man who can't stand up to his wife is a man who can't stand up for his wife, and so just little hard hitting things like that where, of what it means to be the shock absorber, to be the spiritual leader in your home, about how a man is, he's really not a thermometer in his home, but he's a thermostat. He's actually the one setting the tone, setting the temperature, setting those things. And I think that's really helpful. We as a session found this book extremely helpful of just, thinking through and getting on the same page about what steering and manipulation and what kind of things might come our way, that we're all alert and ready to be the shock absorbers when those things hit. And I remember something that was really helpful was just the whole idea of playfulness. I remember that was kind of a passing thing, but when because he talks a lot about this being the crackle kind of underneath, the crackle in the air, and the things that are kind of boiling and simmering underneath. And you can feel that. You can feel that when you're in a meeting. You can feel it when you're in a church. You can feel it when you're in an institution, when there's things bubbling under the surface. There is a crackle in the air. It's charged. Everybody kind of knows it, but nobody will say it. And just about being willing to acknowledge that, And something that's been helpful for me too is like, when you actually name and try to deal with the conflict and the things bubbling underneath, you're going to be accused of causing the conflict. So just be prepared for that, right? But he also talks about this idea of playfulness, and your organization, your institution, your session, your marriage or whatever is probably healthy when there's a playful spirit in it, because playfulness happens in the context where where they're comfortable, where they're authentic and all that. And so when you're not playful, there's probably something underneath that's bubbling.
When the degrees aren't set
where
they need to be.
Yeah.
There is that crackle, but there isn't that crackle.
Right,
When the degrees are set, there's comfort, there's relaxation to be playful. Right. It puts things at ease.
Right. And I just feel like you can walk into an organization and watch how people interact with one another. And, if they're having fun, if they genuinely like each other, if all that, you can tell this is healthy. And if you walk in and it's, if it's all business and everybody just keeps their head down and everything's siloed, this is probably not a healthy thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. Those are great comments. And, he in the section on home, and then he kind of brings it back at the end. He has this, great quote out of C.S. Lewis's Horse and His Boy. You guys probably remember it, but it was kind of brilliant. So I'm going to read it here. And this is out of The Horse and His Boy. It's given by King Loon of Archenland. For this is what it means to be a king, to be first in every desperate attack and last in every desperate retreat. And when there's hunger in the land, as must be now and then in bad years, to wear finer clothes and laugh louder over a scantier meal than any man in your land, right? And so, he's talking about, leading from the front, leading from the back, leading as an example, right? And I think not only is that's, you see that in Nehemiah, right? You see that in various capacities, and how he has good responses to kings and good responses to workers, and how he's trying to serve kind of vertically up and down this long hierarchy, and yet it's kind of a flat hierarchy when you're talking about just, being a Jew rebuilding a wall, but then also it's practical for our homes, and when we're within a group or a body of men, to know that we're all kind of called to laugh the loudest in these hard times, whatever the hard times look like, right? And I think that's a lot, right? That's a lot of gravitas.
Yeah.
So.
And you see it when something hits and the leaders are unfazed, or even if they laugh, everybody's like, oh, it's good, it's all going to be all right, Or you hear people who grew up in the Great Depression and didn't know they were poor because dad didn't act like they were poor, right? He laughed and he came home and he rejoiced over his scanty meal, and the kids grew up thinking, oh, everything's good, and we don't have to be anxious. Dad's got us,
I used to always, like, in Iraq and Afghanistan, a lot of helicopter flights, right? And I've hit bad turbulence. And what I always look at, I look through how are the pilots reacting.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's turbulence. You always hit turbulence, but, and it's like you look at the pilots and they're just cool as cucumbers. You're like, all right, it's just normal. Yeah. Well, one time in Afghanistan, we hit this turbulence. It was a nightmare. I thought, okay, this could be it. Not only that, we're getting shot at. And I go, okay, time to look at the pilots. And I look at the pilots and they are freaking out. They're like hand gestures. They're screaming at each other. And I'm like, oh, yeah, this is bad.
That's a good point. Yeah. So, I think one of the takeaways here is a strong recommendation. I've looked for it used. It's not used. You can get it from a couple places. It's a small book, but it definitely feels like one that I'll go back to for sure over and over again, because it was very encouraging, and it was encouraging in the sense that it felt like God had deep providential concern for us in our anxious time. Like his eye is on the sparrow and he's on us, right? And this book helped, I don't know, it just felt like it articulated very clearly God's providence in our lives, in a sense. So
where can they find the book?
It's on Canon Press.
On Canon Press. And the course, there's a course on Canon Plus, is that right?
Yeah. So we're watching it. I think it's probably it's 7 lectures, and they're like maybe 15 or 20 minutes each. So he's really pretty much covering. Rigney teaches it. It looks like he's in like a bookstore or something, kind of doing it with a small audience. And it's very succinct. It's very concise, but it does follow the book fairly clearly. So I just picked up another book by him. I'm kind of curious, what else he has out there, but strong recommendation. And I would say I've read a lot of leadership books. I know you guys probably have too. This one was great. I would even say it was fairly original. I mean, I don't feel like I've read a lot of like classic business books that changed what Ken Blanchard or Stephen Covey said in the business world. They said it 40 years ago. Basically, everyone's saying the same stuff. But this was a really helpful lens, I thought.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of books are, they're 30-page books. They should have been 30-page books. They get stretched into 200 pages. This is one of those where it's like every sentence matters. Where it's really one of those books where it feels like it could have easily been a 200-page book that got condensed into 75 pages, or I don't know what the exact length is.
I've read a series of books by the leadership expert, but then you realize if you've read one book, you've read all of them. Right?
Yeah,
it's okay. It's a little bit of a nuance, but like you said, this one it has its own niche. It's unique,
and there's no fluff.
Which is refreshing.
It is very refreshing. Yeah,
it feels very sober-minded.
Exactly.
Anyways, thanks guys for joining.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Play the Man podcast. Stay sturdy, friends.